Good morning. This is Dan Viederman, and you can't see me yet. I don't know why, but you'll manage. Camera issues. There we go. Welcome. I'm pleased to kick off this webinar. I'm here because I used to run a social enterprise called Verite, and when I was at Verite, I was haunted by the nagging feeling that there was data out there that we should be leveraging better, but I had really no idea how. We had a couple of oh, let's put it on the web, let's analyze it. But that didn't get us very far. And then so haunted was one emotion, and the other was sort of, to be honest, kind of an annoyance when donors, not Humanity United, but others in corporations, they would say, well, you have data, make it available to us, help us, use it, share it. And I would say, yeah, but first of all, it's confidential. And second of all, why would I? So I had these two sort of emotional reactions to the problem of data. And that then led us, while I was with Humanity United, for us to think particularly with Katrina and Sandy, more deeply about what we might do about this. And that's why I'm thrilled that WikiRate is about to tell us at least one answer to the question of why. And for those of you who sort of share my emotional reactions to the problem of data, but also, as I do, feel that there's tremendous potential in moving beyond the siloed data and beginning to figure out how to collaborate and share and make it better to fill the massive, huge holes we have in visibility about labor rights and supply chains, particularly. Tremendously optimistic as well. So with that, I'm really eager to see where we go. And I guess I turn it back to Laurie.
Thanks so much, Dan. That was wonderful. And yeah, thank you all so much for being here today. We're incredibly excited with you to kind of envision together what an open and integrated labor data ecosystem could look like. And we'll be breaking all of that down into practical recommendations and concrete steps that we can all start to take to start to build this ecosystem together. So maybe just, let me see, I'm just going to get the slides going. Here we are. So while I tell you a little bit more about who WikiRate is, for those of you who don't know us, I would love to ask Lucia to share a poll with you so that we get a little bit of the temperature of the room and get an impression of how familiar everybody is with sharing data and how much that might be part of what you're already doing. So while the poll comes up and you have the opportunity to answer that question, let me just tell you, WikiRate is an open data platform. We are the largest open source registry of ESG data in the world. We have just over 1.6 million data points on companies, and that's about 70,000 companies that we cover so far. And really what the vision for us has always been is to really give society the tools and evidence that is needed to encourage and help companies really tackle the social and environmental challenges that we face today. A lot of our work is really around bringing all of this data together in one place, standardizing it, cleaning it, and integrating with other databases. And so working with data on a day-to-day basis, you can imagine there really is, we were excited and totally game when Humanity United posed this question, this research question of, can there be an open and integrated labor data ecosystem? And if so, what challenges and opportunities are we really looking at? So about 9 months ago, we set out to try and answer that question, building on the work that's being done by lots of amazing organizations in this space, on research that was already being done by Ethos Matters. And so we took a mixed methods approach. We did desk research, interviews, a survey, and really started gathering all this information. And I'm sure several of you on this webinar today will have participated, and we're super grateful for that. So last week, we launched a report that summarizes the findings and gives guidance on the tools and strategies that you can use. And today, we're really kind of going through that, breaking it down, and really trying to demystify as well some of this lingo around tech and data that can sometimes seem a little daunting, but actually isn't all that special. So in the meantime, I see that we have some great results from the poll. So let me just kind of see if we can share the results with you. I hope you can see that now. So there's relatively even spread. Amazing that it looks like everybody is either wanting to share, has tried to share, is already sharing data. So we're definitely having the right crowd here. It looks like we're all ready to start to work toward this ecosystem together. That's really encouraging to see already. So yes, I'll stop sharing that now and get you going on the next slide. Oops, of course. So just a little bit more about what we're going to cover today. First, we're going to really dive into what open data is, what integrated data really means, and what are we talking about when we say labor data. Then we're going to cover a little bit more about the current landscape of sharing between organizations and really unpack the challenges and opportunities that we've came across through the research. Then we will go into, how can we really build this trust around data sharing as well, and how can we make sure it's safe? And lastly, we will then share with you practical tips on how you can start to share data in a more accessible way. Lastly, there will also be discussion, and we would love to hear from you, of course, because we know and acknowledge all the expertise that is already there and the work that's being done. So we'd love to also hear from you. Then just to start you off, really what we talk about with open data is something that the first kind of myth buster really, or the thing that often gets misunderstood is that public data isn't necessarily open data. And when you think about it, it really kind of makes sense. If you read a newspaper article or see a clip on YouTube, that doesn't automatically mean that you can reuse that. Really where we are at is that you need to check the terms of use, and open data really is about always enabling and allowing the reuse of that information, of that content. And so when we take open data, when we unpack that, really we get to two dimensions. There's a legal openness, so the licensing. Does the licensing allow you to reuse it? And an important part there as well is that it's reuse that should be free, or at least for a very a small fee. So the fee might be to be able to continue to reproduce that open data set and continue to add to it, but it really shouldn't be for kind of a profit that you are profit income. So really, this is the kind of licensing part and the legal part of that. When we take the technical openness and we unpack that, there's a few different dimensions to think about. So first, the data should be available. It should be discoverable, and it really should be there as a whole and in bulk. Now, what it means as a whole and in bulk, think, for instance, of a benchmark. If you have just a high-level rating, but you don't know where the information is coming from, the sources, the different methodologies, that's not it as a whole. Or if you, for instance, get data on one particular company, that's not bulk. So it's really this kind of really as much and as expansive as it can get. And a really important part as well is the machine readable format. Now, just making a bit of a sidestep there, when we say machine readable, again, that might sound a little highbrow or complicated, but actually what it means is that a computer needs to be able to process the format, the information that is there. And there's an element of format there. So spreadsheets are great, structured formats like XML. If you have, for instance, JSON, that's amazing. But really, what is almost more foundational to that is that that information is structured. If I do long pieces of text and anecdotes in a spreadsheet, that does mean that a machine can process it, but it might still not really be that I can collate a data set. So there's really those two elements that you want to be thinking about there. I think what is also good to cover, and what Dan was also alluding to, is like, why why make data open? And so really this is about scaling, right? So when we can have that machine readable format, we can actually get computers involved, we can get this automation involved, and we can really scale. I think it's also important to keep in mind that we really came from the notion of like, okay, workers, we want to help improve their lives with this labor data. That's the ultimate user. It's the ultimate use case. And so when you come at it from that perspective, really it doesn't make any sense to all kind of stick in our own little silos. And it's really about that collaboration piece. it helps us, not duplicate efforts. It helps us create this huge shared evidence base and really also kind of scale our impact. If I run one campaign or have one audit report, that really is just that kind of one audience, that one impact piece. But if I open that data up, the life cycle gets extended and others can reuse it for other purposes in other campaigns and other reports, and really keep using that data and keep getting impactful results with that. So what do we mean when we talk about labor data? Again, coming from that place of, what do workers need? How can we help them best? What is the usefulness for them? We really got in this from a quite expansive perspective. So it can be data about workers themselves, about working conditions, wages, collective bargaining, you name it. But it could also be data like import-export records, addresses of facilities, product data. Has it been certified, and where are they really coming from? Is there a traceability there? So we really took this broad perspective and really thinking about what is it in the data that we need in an ecosystem like this to make it most useful. Now, there is, of course, some lines that should not be crossed. And as I'm sure several of you will know, labor data and open might sound a little bit odd, but actually there's really just a very clear line that we can indicate, and that is if there is any individuals that you can identify in your data set, that should not be shared. If it's individuals that are either the data subjects, so maybe workers you interviewed or anything like that, that's definitely not data you need to open up. But also if it's data about those who have been gathering that data. So if you are working with people who go into the field doing those interviews, they might face retaliation if their identity is revealed as well. So it's really about protecting them and making sure that that data is not does not become open and available to anyone. So really what we're working with is the spectrum of openness. We're going from closed data that is really under any kind of licensing and agreement between different organizations that then sets out the terms for that sharing. Maybe there's a shared space, right, where you have a number of organizations. It's a predefined kind of terms under which data can be shared and used and reused. And then you have open, really, where anyone can use that data for any purpose. So that's a little bit to paint that picture for you, to give that spectrum. I'm going to put a pin in that there right now, but my colleague Eileen will come back to these concepts in just a little bit. So then I wanted to kind of take you through a little bit more what the current status is of sharing. We found that through our research, almost a third does not make the labor data that they hold public, which is quite a large group, right? And often these are also really big data sets. So I think it's good to be conscious that, there's a lot of information out there that is not so easily accessible or that we cannot always see unless you have an agreement or are paying a fee or something like that. Then of those that do publish data publicly, we see nearly half don't actually do that but with a specified license. Now, what that means again is that reuse is not you need to get in contact, you need to have that conversation. And so really it means a lot more work to try and figure out, what you can and cannot do. And I think there's definitely an element there that's hampering a lot of the automation piece and that scalability piece. So then maybe just to say a little bit more about that automation piece, there was a really encouraging finding for us that quite a lot of organizations are working with an API. Now, an API, again, sounds more complicated than it is. It's really a way for computers or computer programs to kind of communicate and to share data between their systems. So it's just facilitating that transfer of data between different systems. And it means that, for instance, my system can ping yours or yours can ping mine in an automated fashion to extract or provide the data that we want to share between ourselves. So it's really an encouraging stat, that we found. We must say though that of course there's a variety, and API is kind of like any other applications or software. Some are as good, some has work to do. So it doesn't necessarily mean that everything is rosy and breezy. But yeah, it's definitely encouraging to see that there's so many organizations working with this kind of technology. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Lucia.
Hi there, thanks, Lorraine. So I'd like to speak now a little bit about the research that we did. If you can go to the next slide, please. The research that we did to better understand the use of technology and data by organizations working in the labor rights space. So the first step was to map the landscape of labor rights and supply chain initiatives. And to do this, we mainly analyzed in the first moment publicly available information on 37 organizations and built a taxonomy, mainly looking at what type of data was held by these organizations, whether this data was available to the public and in which formats, and whether there was a specific permission for third parties to use this data, and if so, under which license. And the information we gathered then was complemented with insights that we got from 7 semi-structured expert interviews and the survey responses that we got from 26 organizations working in the field. So with this kind of complementary knowledge, we then built 7 organizational archetypes, mainly based on the use made of by organization of technologies and data to meet their different goals. Yeah, so we can go to the archetypes now. So the first one, we call it the transparency and accountability advocate. And this type of organization gathers and uses that data to generate evidence-based reports to advocate for an improvement of the working conditions of workers within a supply chain, and to monitor also labor rights compliance and call for better disclosure practices. So the main targets for these organizations are the government, policymakers, downstream companies, but they also seek to inform and empower worker rights organizations and unions. They typically do not have like a custom tool for data collection, and they do not share the data they research or gather in the form of datasets, but they maybe aggregate the data and share it within PDF reports. But however, the licensing for the use of that data is not always specified. Yeah, just as an example of an organization that would fall within this archetype, we would have the Clean Clothes Campaign organization. And then we can go to the second archetype, which we denominated the Compliance Data Aggregator. This is an archetype that uses technology and on-site visits to gather information and share information from the suppliers on the working conditions of within certain facilities. And organizations within this archetype are highly engaged with downstream companies who use this service to monitor and know about the risk along their supply chain. The target audience then is companies both downstream and upstream. And they usually have custom tools for data collections and, for instance, a web survey tool. And they have in place API infrastructures to share the data. And the data is typically not made available to the broader public. An organization within this archetype would be, for instance, fair factories. We can then move to the third archetype, and that be the Data Intelligence Hub. This is an archetype that uses maybe more innovative technologies and some techniques from the data science field to manage and generate some kind of risk profiles. The target there are the government, investors, also downstream companies or civil society organizations. As I mentioned, the tech here is a little bit more sophisticated. It can be related to artificial intelligence or scraping tools, but definitely they also have API infrastructure in place. And even though the data is shared between different stakeholders, it's typically not made available to the general public. So an example here would be Ponjiva organization, and then we can move to the fourth archetype, and that's the worker voice tool. And organizations within this archetype, they are building digital tools that are aimed to gather data directly and anonymously from the workers about their working conditions on the ground. And an interesting characteristic is that they are also not only getting data and input from the workers, but also providing the workers with informations, whether it's about their working rights or the risks that they may face if they're working in a certain industry or a certain country. The target audience then is workers and worker organizations and unions, but also downstream companies who are interested to have, an alternative source of information about the working conditions on the ground. The tech that they developed had to do with mobile applications, voice messages, even social media or custom messaging applications. And yeah, given the nature of the data that is collected, the data is not made available for the public. And an example for that archetype would be the Worker Connect app developed by the TechSoup organization. Then we have the traceability tool, our fifth archetype. And these kind of organizations use technology to help downstream companies to monitor their supply chains and to have a better knowledge about the sourcing practices and to improve these practices. And so the main audience here are downstream companies, and the tech they use to gather this data are custom tools for data collection that include blockchain, but it's not the main tool they use. And they also have in place API connections for the data sharing, and the data is also not made available to the broader public. Then our last two archetypes, sorry, I forgot to say the example for the fifth archetype would be maybe trust trace. And then for the sixth archetype, we have it's denominated the open data platform, in which organizations work to gather, clean, host, and kind of link data coming from different sources, and to make it available for the public in accessible and open formats. And another characteristic is that that the public and the users are encouraged to also contribute with data to the platform. The target audience here are civil society organizations, academic journalists, data scientists, and the product public. The tech use are APIs, so their own API, but they also connect to other APIs to share this information in different formats, such as JSON, CSV, or even Excel. The licensing is the open data license, typically the Creative Commons 4.0. And for instance, WikiRate would fall within that archetype, of course. Then we have the last archetype is the knowledge sharing platform, in which organizations in this archetype are committed to improve access to information and information sharing. So they mainly host documents and reports in different formats, and they can verify that they come from reliable sources, and they create an interface that makes easy to access these information resources. The target audience here would be journalists, civil society organizations, and academics, but also can be companies, policymakers, and the public in general. They usually have content management systems in place to pull up these resources and APIs to keep the information updated. However, the licensing is rarely specified in the sites. An example of an organization here would be maybe the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. So yeah, before we move to the next section, I'd just like to just acknowledge that we are conscious that these 7 archetypes do not cover every dimension of the organizations that are out there working with labor data. But this is, what we could analyze with the research we did. And then, of course, it's also possible that organizations find that they belong to more than one archetype, so to speak. So the next section, I'm going to just briefly present the challenges that the organizations we interview and surveyed and shared with us in terms of what is challenging when you're working with data or when you want to share data. So the first one has to do with the quality of the responses that are coming from surveys, and this, the main reasons for this can be, for instance, that there's not a shared understanding on the questions that are being asked, either because there's no conceptual equivalence across different linguistic and cultural contexts. And can also be that online tools do not reach properly in remote locations, so a questionnaire can be not completed or only partially completed. And then, of course, there may be errors when inputting data. And finally, there's the question of the source reliability. So sometimes participants can be bias in their responses, depending on the questionnaire, of course. And then there are other cases where there are suspicions that maybe participants are coerced into entering false information. Then the second challenge, we can go to the next. Yeah, thank you. The next challenge has to do with verifying the data. So it's not only when you're working with data that you collected, but also when you're working with a data set that was shared with you or provided by external organization or source. If you're working only with self-declared data or information, for instance, data reported directly by facilities or companies, and you don't have an alternative data source, then it's difficult to verify whether this data is accurate or not. And lack of context refers to when you are working with a data set that was provided externally to you, and this data set has no context attached as to the methodology that was used to gather this data, or the sample, the original sample, or any other key information that you may use to cross-check the information that you're working with. And then there's the case of unstructured data collection formats. And this is when you have different researchers working on the ground, and they each, have their own formulas or different structures in which they gather the data. And then when you combine those data may be difficult to verify. The next challenge and this was perhaps the most named one, has to do with the standardization of data. So different understandings of key concepts. And for instance, organizations may define concepts differently. So that this goes from the geographies, but also key terms such as supply chain tiers, or what is a wage, or what is understood by overtime. So yeah, that might be a reason to have difficulties when you want to combine different data sets. And then there's the issue of entity recognition. So sometimes two different data sets may have small difference in the names or addresses of the entities that you are analyzing or working with, and that may make the mapping of those entities very laborious and error prone. And then lack of structure, if you're working with qualitative data sets, then you may also run into problems to compare the data sets. Then finally, we have the, please the next slide, the technical capacity, not only of the organization itself, but also the partner organization. Sometimes a counterpart is maybe a smaller organization, and this affects their technical capacity to work with data. And for instance, if one of the organizations do not have an API connection, then of course you may lose access to otherwise very valuable data. Then is the issue of machine, the lack of infrastructure to maybe process some data that may be, in paper format or in PDFs, but that are not actually readable. So if you don't have the infrastructure to extract the data, that limits, of course, your capacity to make an analysis, for instance. And then finally is the access to tools, or the lack of access to tools that otherwise would reduce manual work. For instance, to have access to solutions on the machine learning area. So these were the main challenges shared with us. And then as part of the research, we also identified some opportunities. And for that, I turn to Aileen. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lucia. So I'm just going to go over a little bit the opportunities that we saw through the research, and also looking at kind of fostering how we can foster trust in data sharing, and also some quick tips for organizations. I'm aware that we're kind of talking about some of the bigger challenges in terms of technical capacity, but there are already things that organizations can get to work on in terms of data sharing, which are quite accessible as well. So first of all, how do we improve data quality through data collection? As Lucia said, we had organizations kind of expressing that they would receive data sets and they weren't quite sure, the structure and the content, and they didn't have enough confidence in the level of data verification to feel that they could incorporate that into their work. So one thing that organizations can do is to add kind of additional layers of data verification. So one organization had kind of a firewall where they had groups or individuals working with the data provider and being able to actually check their responses. So rather than just receiving data from a data provider and saying, okay, we accept that data, you might actually then have somebody checking, is there an outlier here? Can we go back and double check that this is really correct? And this can also help with kind of mitigating those problems with data entry that Lucia was talking about as well. And then also adding a bit more structure to data collection formats. Some organizations already have quite a structured method, but there was a lot of variability. So kind of standardizing those templates that you're using. So even if you don't have a customized tool, you can still add data validation to your spreadsheets. And if you're working with anecdotal or qualitative data, it can still be very important to have the researchers, if you have multiple researchers in different locations, have them work together to create a template that can really help the people that then have to process that data to make sure it's as structured as possible and increase that kind of data quality as well. And then another method that you can use is to collect that kind of supplementary evidence to validate your findings. So we had organizations worrying about whether the data that they receive, they can really say, okay, this is right. If they see an outlier, they don't know how to check that. So one organization actually validate wage data using photographed wage slips. So it's just an example of some supplementary evidence that you can kind of collect at the same time as doing your data collection, which can then be used to kind of double check some of those outliers and just generally improve the quality of the data. Next slide, please. So then another opportunity in terms of data management. I think this is a really important one for organizations. So one thing is that if you receive a data set and you don't have context on that data set, it can be very difficult to know how to use the data. And this is the case for sharing data between organizations, but also for within organizations as well. If you have a contact person who really holds the center for a data set and then they leave, you can end up with the gaps in your understanding of that data set as well. So one strategy is to make sure you have good documentation for your data sets. And one example of documentation is metadata. So this is data that, just to give an example, if you have a file on your computer and you go and you get the info, you see the properties, you can really see some extra information there about the file, so you can see who created it, when it was accessed. That's just some example of metadata. But in terms of data sets themselves, you can add a lot more information. So if you're uploading it to a repository, you can kind of label it and tag it with the topics that it covers. And this really just helps with findability and making that data more manageable. And then additional documentation that you can ask is to make sure that if somebody reads additional documentation, they can understand your research and your analysis method. This is a really good way to make your data sets more accessible and more understandable by someone who is having a fresh eye on the data set. So you can even just put it in a README file and kind of zip that with your spreadsheet, and it just gives a bit of more information to the person working with the data. And then in terms of working with supply chains, one of the key issues that we see is entity recognition. So being able to make sure that you are talking about the same facility when you're working between data sets. And one strategy here is to really leverage the unique identifier system. There are different systems out there that are already public, but if there isn't one out there that would suit your use, you can also create your own. And this is just a way to tag each entity with an identifier. And you have existing repositories like the Open Apparel Registry that make these available. And that just really helps you be able to map between entities, between data sets, and it can really save you a lot of time and improve the quality of your data as well. Next slide, please. So then in terms of building technical capacity, as Lucia said, we found some organizations were really lacking technical infrastructure for sharing. And some of the things that they could benefit from would be support to build customized databases, data management systems, as well as investments in API infrastructure and support for machine learning projects as well. One thing that's really important here is to not reinvent the wheel. So there are many open source solutions and tools out there that you can already use which have API infrastructure and they have data management systems. So you can also leverage those. And I think it's also an important point in terms of funding, because we do recognize that the reason that civil society organizations often lack this infrastructure is because it's not really included in the kind of overheads of a project where you are collecting data. But I also want to say that for those organizations that don't yet have this infrastructure in place, there are still quick wins that can really improve the accessibility of your data. And I'm going to come to those at the end of my section. Next slide, please. So one of the really important things with data sharing, as Lorraine was saying, was kind of creating the system of trust. So in terms of the data lifecycle that she was talking about, how can we make that as inclusive as possible? You can see the lifecycle there on your right. It's kind of around planning, collecting, processing, analyzing, sharing, archiving, and reusing. And even from the very beginning of your life cycle, engaging early and often with your data subjects, with the beneficiaries, and also with the intermediaries. Intermediaries are the people and the organizations that take the data and they transform it to make it useful and actionable. And by having this inclusive approach, you can really ensure that the needs and the concerns of your stakeholders are addressed from the beginning and throughout the life cycle as well. So some of the really key questions to think about here around, like, to what end should the data be collected? What data is needed to achieve that goal? Who are the data subjects? How can they be reached? Why would they engage? That's an important one. And also, what are the barriers and risks that you can expect, not just at the data collection stage, but also at the data sharing stage as well, and how you can kind of mediate these. And another important one is what data should not be collected and why. What data should not be shared and why. I think these are really important, and having those stakeholders involved in that process can really help you see your way through that. And then in terms of making that inclusive data lifecycle, building a robust data governance system is really important. So this is where you would be considering your power imbalances, who is controlling the data, who is the data about, and also that this structure is best when it's sort of co-designed by the future participants as well. Next slide, please. And then there's the question of how do we ensure that the sharing is done safely? We go into this in a bit more detail in the report, but in terms of leveraging that inclusive approach, it's really important that you involve those stakeholders in the process. You may find that some parts of your data are never going to be safely shareable. Some data may become safer to share after a period of time has elapsed. For instance, data that's involved in a legal case. At the end of the case, it might not be useful to you anymore, but it might be possible to make that data public so that organizations can track impact over time, for example. And then some data may only be shareable, but obviously it has to be aggregated safely. So anonymization and aggregation techniques are crucial here to ensure that individuals can't be identified. And there are some examples of those in the report as well. And one thing to note also is that some data sets might be a bit too detailed to safely anonymize. And in that case, it might be that you can take smaller parts of your data set and share those in a safe way as well. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to end my section with some quick tips on kind of getting started with opening your data. So there is a bit of a step-by-step guide at the end of the report, but just to sort of go through those steps really quickly. First of all, you need to choose your data set and consider it kind of the ease of release there. You really want to build momentum and build consensus if you're opening up data for the first time. It might be worth starting with a smaller release at first so that you can really test your processes and get people on board with it as well. And then you have to address the legal openness that Lorraine was talking about. So applying an open license is really crucial here. And then making data available, making it technically open. And here, machine readability is key. you can, if you have an API, obviously you can make it available through there. But you can also just make it available in a spreadsheet that's already a machine readable format. So if you don't have the infrastructure in place, it doesn't need to stop you from being able to share your data. And then making data discoverable, that's also very, very important. One way you can do that is to make it available in an open repository. And we give some examples of those in the report. But you can also make sure that you're using kind of data documentation and metadata tagging to really help people find that data as well. So just in terms of the quick wins for organizations, if you don't feel like you have all of this infrastructure in place, that's also fine. In terms of being able to publish data, it's still possible. If you're already publishing PDF reports, but no kind of data spreadsheets, you can really start to put that process at the same time. So just some quick wins: publishing the data in a spreadsheet format, adding documentation to your data when you publish it, your methodology, your analysis method, adding licensing to your data sets, really important. And it doesn't need to be a super complicated process. You just need to state what license you want to put it under when you make that data available. And then, of course, making it available in a pre-existing repository is a great way to help people to find that data. So I'm going to hand back to Lorraine now. She's going to just wrap up and then facilitate our discussion section as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, and I think I would just like to kind of reiterate some of the main points there, just around, like starting, where are you at, what is possible, what's within your reach now, and then seeing it really as this process, right? There's this larger vision that we're working toward, but we don't need to be there all today. And I think it's also really important what Aileen was saying around this idea that, your data, you have this one particular use case, but there's so much that is possible with that information when you start to put it together with other things. So really thinking through the usefulness of the data in a broader way than just for your use case, I think really helps to understand why it is so key to start to open up your data.